Hi, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm so pleased today to be joined by author Gary Indiana and NYRB Classics editor Edwin Frank for a discussion of Curzio Malaparte's Diary of a Foreigner in Paris. We're especially happy to be continuing our ongoing series with our friends at NYRB Classics and to be able to reach all of you in the comforts of your homes. We're coming up on our 50th anniversary next year, and now more than ever in these strange times, we want to live up to our name as a community. It's a BYO program, so please, if you've heard my housekeeping notes from a previous event, go fill up your glass or refill up your glass right now. Otherwise, to the housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click the Ask a Question button, which is just right down here below our screens. And you can submit a question that way. We'll try to get through as many questions at the end of the event as we can. As well, while you're looking down there, you'll see the all-important Purchase the Book Here button, where you can navigate to purchase a copy of tonight's book directly from the bookstore. If you've already got a copy, but you're still feeling generous, there's also a donation button down there, which really helps us to cover the cost of producing tonight's event and kind of keep us floating during these trying times. So thank you in advance. A caveat for tonight's event and all virtual events, we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads. So please bear with any technical issues that might arise during the program. We'll try to solve them really quickly. And if we do happen to reach an impasse, we have a whole backup plan, but fingers crossed we don't, get there. And finally, we're adding more virtual programming every week, and there's a link to sign up for our newsletter. If you click on the title of this event right up here, we're teaming up with The Ballot next week, Wednesday, to present a discussion of Matthew C. Klein's All Trade Wars Are Class Wars. And our NYRB Classics series continues 2 weeks from tonight, welcoming Amit Chaudhuri live from India to present his novel, Friend of My Youth, in conversation with Edwin here. You can register for these programs by navigating to our store profile, also up here at the top. So now a little about tonight's presenters, and we'll get started. Described by Christian Lorentzen of the London Review of Books as one of the most brilliant critics in America today, Gary Indiana is the author of 7 novels, including Resentment, 3 Month Fever, Rent Boy, and Horse Crazy. His nonfiction books include Let It Bleed, The Schwarzenegger Syndrome, and Utopia's Debris. I Can Give You Anything But Love, his first and only memoir, was published recently. I'm also going to make a note that Gary wrote a simply fantastic piece on Malaparte in Book Forum a number of years ago, and I'm going to post a link to that in the questions field here below, so please feel free to click on that after the event. Edwin was born in Boulder, Colorado, and educated at Harvard College and Columbia University. He is the author of Snake Train, Poems 1984 to 2013, and the editorial director of the NYRB Classic series. So Gary and Edwin, the stage is yours.
Okay, thanks, Hal.
Okay.
Thanks to Community Bookstore. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, and thank you, Gary, for being here insofar as we are here.
My pleasure.
To discuss Malaparte. Journal of a Foreigner in Paris, which has been really quite wonderfully translated by Stephen Twilley and has an introduction by Edmund White, is the 4th book by Malaparte that we have published in NYRB Classics. We've published his 2 most famous books, Kaputt and The Skin, as well as The Kremlin Ball, a book about the Soviet Union in 1929. A novel, sort of. We'll get to that. I want to talk a little bit about Journal of a Foreigner in Paris to begin with, just so that, and how the book came to be, just so that you all, those of you who haven't read the book, will have some sense of what we're talking about as we go on. Malaparte had published Kaputt. Malaparte was little known outside of Italy until he published Kaputt in 1945. And that book was an international bestseller. It's a book which is really a kind of behind the Axis lines account of the Second World War. So he had become an international figure, and he was working, and by the time he came to put together this journal on The Skin, which is a book about his role, about being in Naples with the occupying Allied force. So a book basically where he has switched sides. that made his position in post-war Italy, notwithstanding his new fame as a writer, and being famous as a writer always makes your position difficult. Well, that made his position in Italy uncertain, because since he had been on the one hand close to the world of Mussolini, if not to Mussolini, and then close to the Americans, he wasn't really, it meant that nobody really much trusted him. And so in 47, with an election looming in Italy, an election which he thought the left, that is to say the communists, might win, he headed to Paris. And Journal of a Foreigner in Paris basically recounts his 2 years in Paris. It's full of conversations, encounters with beautiful men and beautiful women, and accomplished men and accomplished women. It's full of ruminations on the post-war world, on the nature of art. It's full of sort of word painting. I mean, there are wonderful, Malaparte is a great phrase maker, so you get things like searchlights scouring a sky that is dark and red like the inside of a nostril, or the trees beyond the canal plunge their stiff peaks with their still static leaves shining like tin, caught in the hazy sky like a syringe needle in a wad of cotton. So it's a very conscious work of art, really, and it is like his other books in not really being what it purports to be. Just as Kaputt is somewhere between a novel and reportage, likewise ditto The Skin. Journal of a Foreigner in Paris isn't really a journal. It's more a sketchbook, maybe towards a book he never quite figured out how to write. He has himself a little sketch of a preface in which he says, playing up the equivocality, which was so characteristic of him, a diary is a tale, the tale of a slice of life, which is the very definition of a novel. The diary is a theatrical work brought to the boards of the page. It's at the point at which the tale comes closest to the theater. That, at least, he says, is what my diary is. The other way in which this book is rather similar to Malaparte's other books is that it's a lot about Curzio Malaparte. And here I'll turn things over to Gary to talk about this peculiar, equivocal man of the 20th century, though maybe he isn't even that.
Well, it's hard to say if he's a man of the 20th century or the 19th century in certain respects, but Malaparte is a very interesting figure for many, many, many reasons. I think in terms of today's literary configurations that are, kinds of arguments that go on today, we could say he was a progenitor of the auto-fictional novel in a sense, although, like all writers, he was just a born liar. And he had a tremendous facility at making a mountain out of a molehill. I mean, he got, I don't know how many books he got out of being in Russia for a month in 1929, but a lot. And his story is very fascinating to me because he's a dandy, but a kind of Mussolini-ish dandy, but kind of a figure of machismo, and yet not really. There's something very glissando about his masculinity. There's a very vulnerable side to him. But to get to the story of his life, basically, I mean, he was educated at the best Catholic university. He fought in the First War. His lungs were damaged in the First War in a poison gas attack. He was, the first book he wrote was Viva Caporetto, which was about a mutiny of Italian soldiers after a chlorine gas attack. And it's a very famous desertion of 100,000 troops. And his first book was an impassioned defense of these soldiers who were put in an impossible situation. He I'm not really clear on how he got into diplomatic circles, but he was press liaison at the Versailles Conference. He subsequently, the March on Rome was very soon after the war, really. I mean, he aligned himself with the fascists. He aligned himself with both sides of the fascist argument, whatever, and was participated in the March on Rome with Mussolini. After the Tagliati assassination in 24, I think, I made a note here. Alfredo Frassati had owned La Stampa, which was the oldest newspaper in Italy. And they reported extensively on all of the political intrigues behind the Tagliati assassination, which was, the main socialist deputy in Congress was assassinated by Mussolini's proxies. The paper went into a whole investigation of that. Mussolini forced Frassati out of the editorship of the paper and put in what's his name? Agnelli, Giovanni Agnelli. The older Agnelli.
Yeah.
And he appointed Malaparte to be the editorial director of the paper. And shortly after that, Malaparte went to Russia, went to the Soviet Union, and
as part of the diplomatic corps in that case.
He was doing something for Agnelli. That's all I know about it at this juncture. But it wasn't simply that he was reporting or acting in a diplomatic capacity. He was doing some sort of business maneuver for Agnelli. And then when he returned to Italy, they didn't like the direction he was taking the newspaper. It was reporting on strikes and things that they didn't want covered. So he was fired. The life story is a bit confused. He
was arrested.
Sorry?
Is it soon after that he was arrested and sent into exile?
Well, that again, he was arrested, I think, 4 times between 1938 and 1943. By his account, he languished in prison forever. I think he was probably in jail for 2 or 3 days, actually. And of course, throughout this book, he refers to his horribly punitive exile in Lipari, which, by his account seems to have lasted forever, but it was a year. And Lipari is not a maximum security jail. It's an island in the Mediterranean. He then was allowed to go to Ischia, which is the spa, and then to Forte dei Marmi on the coast. And during those years, he wrote, actually early 30s, he wrote a book called The Technique of the Coup d'etat, which was an enormous bestseller. Mm-hmm. He talked about the methods of Lenin, the tactics of Trotsky, the methods of Lenin, the methods of Mussolini, and he wrote a very unflattering chapter on Hitler, called Hitler, a Woman. What else did he produce during that time? Well,
was he building his famous house at that time too? He starts in the 30s.
The house was under construction, I think, at the beginning of the 40s. Mm-hmm. I'm not too clear on how long when it commenced. It took a very, very long time because they had one architect. He had an architect that he had hired. He didn't finally like the plans of the architect, so he took it over and built this fantastic house on Capri. But he didn't really live there until after the Second War, I don't think. Mm-hmm. Even though I believe in one of the books he talked. Well, I don't know. I don't know, because I remember in one of the books he claims that Himmler or Goering, I can't remember which one, came to the house in Capri, and he was boasting about that he had designed the landscape rather than the house. And that may have been during the war, but I just, I should have made some notes on those exact dates, because I remembered that the house took an enormously long time, and he had actually undertaken construction of a different house in Porto de Mani during the period he was there, and then broke off when I think he managed to acquire this plot of land in Capri. But I'm not sure exactly.
So often out of favor with the fascist government, and to some extent inconvenienced, he basically remained on working terms with Mussolini, and was particularly close, and he's open about that in books like Kaputt, with Ciano, the son-in-law, who was also the foreign minister of the fascist government.
Yeah, Ciano probably rescued him several times from a more
severe sort of
onerous punishment for his transgressions, which were mostly that he couldn't keep his mouth shut. I mean, he just said what he saw, and even despite all of the embellishments and made up stories, I mean, he played his cards wrong almost every time, and I believe the thing that he was supposedly, that was his worst thing, was something to do with Italo Balbo, who was sort of the Lindbergh of Italy, the aviation guy who actually finished up in a rather ignominious way because he was shot out of the sky in Libya by his own troops. I love stories like that. Supposedly he said something terrible about in a private letter, which got intercepted or something, about Balbo.
There's even the story in this book, and I'll ask you in a minute to read from it, of the first time he gets in trouble with Mussolini. And again, one never knows what he is. Mussolini summons him. He waits forever. He thinks it's going to be his chance to actually to be promoted. He's still, eager to make a mark and he waits and waits and realizes that he's in trouble, and is summoned in. And Mussolini and his right hand and left hand man are glowering at him. And finally, he sort of says, "What have I done?" And
yeah, you know what? I don't remember exactly where that is in here. It wasn't one that I marked because.
No. I'll just tell the rest. So Mussolini said, "You've been saying bad things about my ties."
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then Mussolini starts to take his leave, and then he turns around at the door and says, "Can I say one thing in my defense?" And Mussolini says, "Sure, what?" And he says, "You're wearing an ugly tie now."
Which gets him, I mean, sort of almost a pass as a kind of court jester when sometimes things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that seems to have been the role he wanted to play, but he was a great he was a womanizer. One of the things that he doesn't mention in the beautiful scene at the end here, where he goes with is she a countess? He goes with the Princess Jane de Faustino Bourbon del Monte to the wonderful ball that nobody has showed up for. Actually, he was having an affair with her daughter, who had been married to the son of Agnelli. This was a huge scandal because Edoardo Agnelli died in a plane crash while Malaparte was having an affair with his wife. After he died, they made plans, the younger Del Monte woman, to get married, and the Agnelli family absolutely forbade it. And they said that if she married Malaparte, they would take her children away from her. So this marriage never occurred. But I mean, in his work, you see that there's no sex in any of Malaparte's work. I mean, none. I mean, there are no depictions of sex, except some very outrageous scenes in the skin, which are really bizarre. But he was a great womanizer, and a lot of the scenes that flash backward and forward in particularly in the skin, but also in Kaputt, and also in here in the Crown and Ball, I think were all scenes where he was chasing after a woman. He doesn't say so, but I have a feeling that that's what generated a lot of those those episodes.
Why don't you read the selection you made from the?
Sure. The first one that I picked out was the Artist Sandower. Oh well, no. This one is very nice. It's Sunday, September 14th, 1947. This morning at Moulin de Saint-Roch at the Cerols with André and Antonia Lichtwitz. It had been 14 years since I last saw emerge on the distant horizon at the far end of the yellow plain the two spires of Chartres Cathedral. Rambouillet is one of the regions I cherish most in France, perhaps for the memory of Barbara of Glenway Westcott. You published a book by Glenway Westcott. Yeah. A few kilometers outside Maintenant, we take a left past Saint-Pierre, head down the coast toward Jouet, cross the Eure, and soon after reach the Moulin de Saint-Roch. The other day, Michelin taught me the difference between fleuve and rivière. France has four fleuves, or four watercourses that flow into the sea: the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, and the Rhone. All the others are rivières, or tributaries of the fleuves. Among all the rivières of France, the Eure is one of the happiest, the clearest, the most serene. A watercourse, one would say, designed by Le Nôtre, the great gardener who must have designed all the rivières and all the woods, the deep valleys and the coasts in this happy landscape. Along each side of the Eure, no wider than 20 meters, with uniform banks no higher than half a meter above the slow, limpid waters, rises a line of poplars and weeping willows. Now and then, the Eure enters a forest of bright green leaves shining in the September sun. The air is warm, windless, and yet a rustle of leaves runs through the air up there, and a magpie skims the top of the grass, hiding in the depths of the ferns. Swarms of long-legged flies glide over the current, scatter and reunite. The sky is high. It seems like the Ukraine sky, with thick clouds on the horizon, castles of white clouds over Rambouillet, Fontainebleau, Orléans, Chartres. Despite being a region of farmers and one of the richest regions in Europe, a land of golden earth, the cradle of wheat under a flawless, unfurrowed, very young blue sky, despite being a region of plains, albeit one split by deep ravines and seamed by the Eure Valley, Beauce has something mysterious, something secret about it. It's not a region of farmers like so many others, attached to the earth, stingy, small-minded, isolated, mean. There's something about Beauce I wouldn't know how to explain. There's Chartres Cathedral. It wasn't the kings of France or the great feudal lords, but the small proprietors who, with their own money, built the most beautiful cathedral in France, one of the most beautiful cathedrals in Europe, the miracle of Chartres. I was speaking one day in 1932 with Marcel Schwab. He devoted some very beautiful pages to Chartres. Chartres, he said to me, stands in a defenseless region exposed to every assault in the most vulnerable parts of the Ile-de-France. But the cathedral is both temple and fortress. It's like those ancient sanctuaries whose most revealing and famous example is Cumae, near Naples, which in a certain way represents the dwelling place, the house, the palace of God in the heart of the country. Chartres is the heart of France. Don't go searching for it hither and yon. The heart of France is here at Chartres, in the middle of this region of farmers. The ancients always placed their sanctuaries in regions rich in wheat or olive trees or vineyards. Delphi is a region that is one of the richest in oil in all the world. The Itea olive tree forest is without a doubt the largest in the world. Cumae is rich in grains, as the sanctuary at the mouth of the Seille in Italy, and the shrine of Our Lady of Divine Love near Rome, and all the sanctuaries of antiquity, that of Diana in Ephesus, rich in grains and olive trees and vineyards, that of Jupiter with the dirty feet, of Neptune at Paestum, at Diana on Lipari. And it goes on. But I think it's a lovely passage, and it also gives you an idea of how, how far-ranging Malaparte's treasure chest of references and memories are, because he really did range all over them. He had been everywhere, and to me, it's somewhat more interesting than the fact that he had known everybody, because, of course, some people that he claims to have known he didn't, but but he did seem to have known everybody. But just his feeling for landscape, his sensitivity to regions of the earth. I mean, the book opens with him in an airplane with Rossellini.
Yes, he writes, Mussolini is with me, as if, inevitably somebody...
of course.
Yeah, right.
But he's looking down and he sees these rivers and he's saying, well, that's this and that's this. And yeah, of course, Rossellini's with me. But yeah, he's a supreme name dropper, but it's interesting. I mean, the name dropping is very interesting. It's very compelling at times, but also this book is fascinating to me for, the names that he chooses to drop and how he chooses to drop them, because you can see that there's a constellation of people who were very compromised during the war that he aligns himself with somewhat surreptitiously. I mean, he doesn't say, but, Cocteau, people like this, who were not exemplars of the resistance. And I think the book is very, it's not bitter all the way through, but there is a real bitterness in here, that he comes back to Paris, where he had enjoyed himself very much in the early 30s, and had known all of the literary lights, and traveled in all the salons and made a figure of himself. And when he goes back, of course, it's a whole different world. You have the world of the resistance, of Camus and Sartre and any number of people we could name. These were the new people, and they were not very forgiving of people like Malaparte. If Celine hadn't fled, he probably would have been killed right after the war. It took a couple of years for people to see things in a somewhat different.
Well, I mean, that's very much in a way. There is in a way a plot to the book, which because it begins with this sort of declaration that this is a great homecoming. For 14 years, he says, I've been in exile in Italy, but now I'm coming back to France. And he dwells on the fact that that he had first fought in the French Foreign Legion. And of course, the read about Chartres shows an intense love of the French landscape and French culture, which he continues to talk about. But his reception is not terribly friendly, and it seems and the word in the title "foreigner" is one that he dwells on increasingly defensively. That is, I think he is in some way expecting to be embraced as a man of letters among other men of letters, but reading between the lines, he's quite clearly been shunned.
Yes. There's several scenes in the book, one with Mauriac, another with Camus, where he really feels, he claims to feel bewildered at their coldness towards him. There's this kind of willful blindness going on that's, embedded in the book. I mean, what did he expect?
Yeah.
One can, say what you want about the self-righteousness of people that were in the resistance, but they were in the resistance. Mm-hmm. And he cannot claim that, and he does in this book.
He does keep claiming that he was somehow, as much in the resistance as they, by which he's really wanting to say that they are as compromised as he,
Right.
There is a gulf between their respective positions, which he is unwilling to face, really. Yeah.
Well, I think he had a notion of the life of an artist, the life of literary artists, being in some way immune to the vagaries of political fortunes, because in many ways, I mean, his notion of politics, as it's inscribed in this book, is bizarre. You know, he as the supreme example of resistance in Italy, he's talking about Pirandello, who was a member of the fascist party through the whole war. I mean, and it's not like Pirandello, it's not like we reject Pirandello because of that. You know, we don't reject his work because of that any more than really reject, you know, Malaparte's work for how he positioned himself during the war. I mean, it says in the preface of your edition of Kaputt, I think, that the guy that drove him around told people afterwards that he had written Kaputt almost entirely with the idea that the Nazis were going to win. And once he realized they weren't, he rewrote the whole book. And you know, I mean, I don't like to be moralistic about people like Malaparte because I feel that they add to the richness of our literary experience. I love Celine, and I know he was a horrible human being in some ways, you know, but there's certain affinities between. I mean, Malaparte's style, of course, is much more. I think he wanted very much to be Proust. He wanted very much to be Marcel Proust, and he couldn't quite do that. So
no, I have the sense. I had the sense at certain points in reading this book, together with maybe The Skin and also The Kremlin Ball, which though it talks about events in 29, he was working on at the same time, that he wanted to sort of devise a kind of big multi-panel fresco of the world of the 20th century, where he would be the sort of Marcel, the Malaparte, hearing the different confidences of people. And this perhaps was meant to be the almost satirical comic literary section, except that he ended up being the butt of the joke, which wasn't exactly what he wanted to feel it. But it's a strange endeavor. I mean, he also, in some sense, presents himself as a kind of man out of time at various points in here, as a dandy, a wit of another century, a lover of beauty. And, you know, he says Pirandello can be excused for he's a member of the resistance, as you said. Of course, the other thing is contrarian. So, you know, he will say in the middle of this book, I love Marxism. Marxism is the greatest thing. It's the only philosophy of loneliness. And you're sort of like, what?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, some of his pronouncements are utterly baffling. But you know, one of the things I've always thought about Malaparte was that he was somebody who really didn't believe in anything, but had a really powerful desire to believe in something. Mm-hmm. And so you see this kind of promiscuity in terms of his ideological, you know, the whatever flimsy allegiance he could give to some ideology, he did. I mean, he ended up, you know, proclaiming himself a Maoist, and at the same time returning to the Catholic Church, so to get all his bases covered. But you know, I think that, well, I mean, much as I think he'd like to have believed in fascism, he didn't believe in that either. Yeah. I think he saw the absurdity of things in ways that are not that far from the way Sartre would see them. Mm-hmm. In a way, I mean, Sartre was, of course, much more committed and had much more political conviction. I mean, real political conviction about things. But in terms of seeing how absurd the structures that human beings construct, you know, to maintain society, I think that he couldn't help but see how funny it all was. Mm-hmm. Funny in a very dark and kind of miserablest way. Yeah. At times.
It's clear too that I mean, we may be giving the impression that though Malaparte is always at the center of his books, that Malaparte is the subject of his books, but he's actually, and I think Montale said this about him, it's quoted in one of our introductions, he was apparently a formidable listener. He was able to bring people out, and people clearly, I mean, he certainly presents it as if people wanted to, in some sense, confess to him. But part of the power of something like Kaputt, and it's here too to some extent, is that people will tell him things that which in some cases he may have made up, but he makes it believable that he draws them out. And I think you've compared him to some extent to Kapuscinski as being also a kind of a fabulist of his own life, but one who seems to represent, bring out an underlying truth of dark situations, as Kapuscinski does in The Emperor.
Well, I think that particularly scenes in Kaputt where he's interacting with people like Frank, who was the, who's the capo of Poland, the provisional governor of Poland, and Ante Pavlik, who was the, Croatian monster. Even if some of those things didn't happen, I think that he was providing a kind of documentary that was more true than a documentary. In other words, I think he probably pulled out of people things that they would never have said to most people, let's say. I mean, I can believe that he had that gift because he was apparently formidably charming. He spoke many languages and was, he was fluid in society. He was one of the great social climbers. And that, I don't look down on social climbing. I think that's interesting. It's interesting when people have the gift of that. You learn a lot about the other strata of society if you're a good social climber. I'm not, but I wish
No, well, he is curious. I mean, curiosity is certainly one of the things that shows up again and again and again in this book about how people have turned out. How they've escaped the war and what their changing reputations and stakes are in society, and also this is, I mean, we should bring out some Malaparte's other odd elements. There's, of course, his love of the macabre and the morbid, and corpses feature throughout his work, and he even has, I think, a little memory here of a kind of first dream or something like that about when somebody has pointed out about his work that it's full of corpses.
It's full of corpses.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found a passage in, should I read it? There's a passage in the Skin that I marked for that very reason. This is happening in Naples. Dawn was already breaking and a light green mist was forming on the skin of the mourners' faces, on the plaster of the walls, and on the gray blanket of the sky, in which gaps had been torn here and there by the bitter wind of early morning. And through the rents a pinkness was visible like the new flesh that forms over a wound. The crowd continued to wait in the courtyard, praying aloud and every so often interrupting its prayers to give expression to its grief. At about 10 in the morning, pandemonium broke loose. Weary of the long wait, impatient to have news of their dear ones, to know if they were really dead or if there was any hope of saving them, and fearful of being betrayed by the doctors and orderlies, the crowd began yelling, cursing, and hurling stones against the window panes, and finally, by sheer weight of numbers, they broke open the doors. As soon as the heavy portals yielded, the deafening, ferocious clamor died down as if by magic, and silently, like a pack of wolves, panting, gritting their teeth, every so often peering through doorways, running with lowered heads through the passages of the ancient building made fetid and filthy by time and neglect, the crowd invaded the hospital. But having reached the entrance to a cloister from which dark corridors radiated in every direction, they burst into a terrible cry and halted, petrified with horror. On the floors, piled up on heaps of garbage, blood-stained garments and damp straw, lay hundreds and hundreds of disfigured corpses, their heads enormous, swollen through suffocation and blue, green, and purple in color, their faces crushed, their limbs truncated, they're torn right off by the violence of the explosions. In a corner of the cloister stood a pyramid of heads with wide open eyes and gaping mouths, with loud cries, frantic wails, and savage laments. The crowd threw themselves on the dead, calling them by name in voices that were terrible to hear, fighting for possession of those headless trunks, those torn limbs, those severed heads, those miserable remains which deluded pity and love seemed to recognize. That's not a unique passage.
No. Well, there's the passage where a body washes up in the Seine that he in the journal. There's also the dog business.
Oh well, yes, the dog business. Well, if you, I mean, do you mean like that he barked like a dog?
Yes.
Often. When you say the dog business, I think about the dog Phoebo, which he claimed had been, he'd discovered mid-vivisection, his dog that went missing, which is completely made up.
Oh yeah.
The dog died of old age at his brother's house.
Well, he claims throughout this book that that the only friends he had when he was on the island of Lipari were the dogs, and therefore ever since, wherever he travels, he this doesn't come up in any of the earlier books. He likes to sit out and bark with the dogs in the evening and converse with them.
Yes.
Whether we're to believe this, we don't know either. But
I don't believe he was alone on Lipari. I think people went to visit him there. But I think so. It wasn't unusual for people to go there. But well, I mean, he dramatized his suffering. Let's say he.
Well, though, I mean, also with a peculiar. I mean, he also almost makes it a little absurd, so that there is that peculiar. He's always a performer.
Well, the beginning that you read about his work is very theatrical. Let's put on a show, which I think is what's riveting in Kaputt and in The Skin is it presents you a spectacle that you'll never forget. I mean, it's just indelible. Some of these scenes that he presents, you don't know if they're true, if they're not true. I think it's irrelevant. In a way, whether they're true. I think the only way in which it would be important, whether it was true or not, would be if you were trying to factually find out something, and of course one does that almost instinctively because you read these things about, Madame Trotsky and different people like this. You think, can that possibly be true? And when you dig into it, you find most of the time, well, maybe not. Probably not, but tremendous powers of invention. So the quite forgivable, I think. I mean,
how did you come to Malaparte?
How did I come to Malaparte? Well, I mean, I was saying earlier before we went on, I remember my aunt had a copy of The Skin in her bookcase, and she was not somebody that read. I mean, she had a lot of books, but she never read them. But I think it was probably very. I think maybe just seeing that book on her shelf when I was a kid later made me want to read it.
Yeah.
Because as I remember, the Avon edition had the same cover on it for decades, and or I think it was the Avon edition. The first time I read Kaputt, I was, I think, in my 20s, and I just was astonished by it. I was so happy when more of his work came into English. I mean, I've read some of it in French, but I don't. I'm so lazy.
Yeah.
If something's not in English, it takes me forever to actually, tunnel through it. But I was always interested in him because he seemed to me, especially, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago, I started to become very interested in the people who didn't get lucky in the Second War. People like Knut Hamsun,
Mhm.
Gottfried Benn,
Mhm.
Celine, who I've always just had tremendous regard for Celine as a writer. Not so much as a person, obviously, but you know, to me, like a writer is what they write. Unless I know them personally, what do I know? Who they are, what they are. And it seemed to me that there was something very interesting, sort of embedded in the work of, or let's say something compelling in the work of people like Droy Rochelle. People who had picked the wrong horse, you know, and run with it, and that had tremendous talent and could have, you know, it could have been different. I'm always interested in how people confront history when they have to. You know, when it comes right up to their noses, because most of us don't. Let's face it. Most of the time, even writers that are very committed writers, you know, there are very few examples in recent history of writers that have had to pick a side in an ideological conflict. I think the closest thing lately has been the thing with Peter Handke, you know, or Limonov. You know, where you can really see that it's possible to make really bad choices as a writer and suffer for. I mean, I'm maybe getting off the track a little bit here, but that's always been of interest to me for many years. You know, and also the way people cover their tracks afterwards is always very funny.
Why don't we have people ask some questions, because I see there are some questions.
Sure, yeah, let's do that.
And there's a lot of questionable issues here.
Yeah,
you guys have covered a lot of ground, so let's see what else we can dig up. This one, can you discuss some of the stylistic fissures between Kaputt / The Skin and Diary? Are there any major breaks that you saw reading them or editing them?
Stylistic breaks. I think that, well, you know, the two big books, Kaputt and The Skin, I mean, they're very large and imposing compositions. They're not. They don't. The Diary has a much more, you know, diaristic tone to it, although the same sort of lyricism that sometimes well, nothing particularly ugly happens in the Diaries. I mean, nothing.
Yeah, those other books are really very polished compositions. I mean, Kaputt has got a series of animal metaphors it works through and so on. Whereas this really feels like a sketchbook, and I think, well, as I said before, I think almost a sketchbook for a novel he was thinking of writing. I mean, there are passages which are actually counter-diaristic here, in that he leaves gaps for names, and you would expect to see the gaps. And he never published the book himself, obviously. So
yeah,
gaps for names is almost as if he's leaving a space for you know, I know who this person is. What will I call this character if I turn it into a book?
You know, I think the same is true of the Kremlin Ball, because you can see that could have been a very full novel if he had developed it more. Because I mean, the closest that he came to Proust, also in a certain way.
What was he thinking of calling it? Something like Du Côté de chez Stalin or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah.
So our next question, this is directed to Gary. Gary, you mentioned that Curzio Malaparte might be considered a progenitor of contemporary autofiction. Where else do you see his influence or legacy in contemporary writing?
Well, I you know, when I say that it relates to autofiction, I'm being a little bit, I'm not entirely sincere about that. I mean, the way that Malaparte is inscribed in this book is very different than the way that people who are, let's say, writing memoirs and giving themselves liberties, fictional liberties. It's not quite the same thing. Who would I would see? Who and where would I see it? Possibly. Okay, it's not autofiction, but it's something I can relate to him. Would be the author's name, I think, is Villard, who wrote the Order of the Day, and made this perfect novel, very perfect novel out of the this conference that Hitler had with these industrialists.
Oh.
Are you familiar with it? It came out like about a year ago.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
It's a perfect novel. I mean, it's not auto-fiction in the sense that the author is not in it, but he's taken a historical supposition. I mean, he's compressed a lot of history into a very, very short space. Okay, that's not autofiction. I will. That's not what people think of as autofiction. I think, well, maybe somebody like Maggie Nelson. I don't know. I think I'd have to think about it. Because what I'm concerned with is what gets fictionalized, is different than what contemporary writers who are writing so-called autofiction, what they fictionalize is not, you can't really relate it to what Malaparte fictionalized.
It's not history the way. Yeah.
It's not history. It's of no historical importance, let's say, or historical insight. It's, because we're in an age of look at me, look at me, look at me, me. Which is why I don't really read much autofiction. Because, I'd rather look at me if I'm not looking at me. Not really. I can't stand looking at myself. But
I think that answered that question just fine. Let's see. Isn't Welbeck on a similar path in our own times?
Do you want to answer that, Edwin?
I'll try. There is a way in which Welbeck is sort of a court jester and a provocateur, which is clearly something that Malaparte, that was one of the ways I think he conceives of his role. But Welbeck is really, in some ways, a very Voltairean figure, doing sort of moral thought experiments. I mean, he's really... He's a French moralist posing as an immoralist, and that
sounds exactly right.
And he isn't. He's not nearly as polished and beautiful a writer, which is actually a nice element of actually an appreciative quality of a quality I appreciate about Welbeck is that the slightly chewy open form avoids the overly mannered character of some recent French writing. But Malaparte is a beautiful stylist at his best. I mean, that's the other thing is if for all the equivocality of the books, the limpidity of the style at its best is miraculous.
Well, that's his strong suit because actually, I mean, he can carry you away just really on a beautiful current of complete falsehood. I mean, he really can. He's a beautiful writer. There's no question that I mean, he's very convincing in many, many ways that have nothing to do with the intellect. I mean, that has nothing to do with intellectualism. He makes a lot of intellectual pronouncements in this book, which I always think similar to Goethe's theory of color, which is completely wrong, but it's beautiful to read. It has no scientific validity whatsoever, but it's gorgeous.
And I think Goethe knew it too. But
yes, he did know it, I'm sure.
Anyway.
Okay, let's see. Next question. Some look to literature instrumentally as a means to be more empathetic, morally aware. Malaparte seems to challenge this possibility with his equivocation around fascism. How do we understand what you just said, Gary, earlier in the event, about the richness of the literary experience?
Well, I would say that if you want to understand how people thought, how many people thought, and how what code of sentiments they were operating by in the period between the wars, for instance, or during the Second War, regardless of which side they were on, you know, it would be impossible not to read Celine, not to read Malaparte, not to read any number of writers who you may not morally feel very comfortable with. But if you want to know how people actually experience these things, who didn't think the way you do, didn't have your code of sentiments, didn't have your sense of, you know, what was right, what was wrong, you need to read these things. You need to expose yourself. It's no point in not knowing what people, you know, there's. In terms of empathy, I don't know that we can demand empathy from writers. I don't think empathy is necessarily the strongest thing you can have as a writer. I think, you know, of course it's good to have empathy as a person, but it's not necessary for a writer. I mean, that's maybe a very loaded thing to say, but it's not the first thing I look for in a writer is empathy. I look for, you know, insight, intelligence, a way of describing being in the world, which, you know, doesn't eo ipso produce empathy. You know, you produce empathy out of other things, out of your experience of other people and your wishes for yourself and, you know, what you live by. But in terms of, I think that The Skin, for instance, is an incredibly empathetic book. It's empathetic toward the Neapolitans. You know, it's so complete. His love of the Neapolitans is so strong in that book. You know, he defends them at every turn against, you know, the opinions of the others, the opinions of the Americans. The Americans don't understand these people that they've, you know, just conquered. And he is telling them how to understand the Neapolitans and how to have empathy for them. So you can't say he's not an empathetic figure. He's just not empathetic towards the things that some people maybe wanted him to be empathetic to.
Yeah.
Edwin, do you have a position on this?
Well, as Gary said, writers have different qualities, and clear-sightedness and unforgivingness can be amongst them. I mean, there are things to which it is one wants a sharp perspective, which brings out some of the grain of reality, and that does not necessarily come with empathy, and it certainly doesn't necessarily come with moralism. Moralism asserts a particular moral stance, but it's the texture of existence is much more complicated. I think that, I mean, Malaparte at his best, I think he would have liked to be, and at his best he approaches someone a bit like Goya in The Disasters of War, a consummate artist with fantastic technique who deploys every trick of the trade to bring out scenes that mercifully most of us have never had to witness.
I'm going to pick a last question since we're reaching the end of the hour. I like this one. This one's for Gary. Has the grotesquerie of Malaparte's work, for instance, the feast scene in The Skin, had any influence on your own writing?
No, because I have experienced plenty of grotesquerie in my own society and my own time. I don't really need to be influenced by anybody else. I'm waiting for the Malaparte of this period. It would be really something. The grotesquerie, but well, who knows what influences you? I don't, I'm not conscious of it, but who knows? Maybe. I didn't really think that my books were that grotesque, but maybe they are. I guess maybe. I know one thing that I have in common with him is that I, look at things that other people don't want to look at, but that's, I never think that way. I never think, oh, I'm writing something that's going to, freak people out. I just, it doesn't occur to me until afterwards when people say, how could you write that? I mean, but that's the writer's law.
Well, Gary, I finished Rent Boy last night, so I'm just going to agree with our question maker. Okay, that's all we have left for this program. I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Edwin. This was fantastic.
Thank you, Hal.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Edwin, thanks.
I have been certainly masquerading this as a gift that I wrapped myself at the beginning of last month just to get me through, and I am so pleased that we got to pull it off. So also thanks everyone again for watching. As a reminder, we are going to be continuing our NYRB Classic series. If you click on our name up here, Community Bookstore, you can see all of our events. A lot of those are already online. We're going to be doing them throughout the summer. While we can't meet in person, we can certainly meet on here. So thanks again to our presenters. And Gary, do you have something you want to say?
No. I didn't know if we would stay on here after the other people were gone, or
no. I just hit in broadcast and we're wrapped.
All right.
Oh, okay, good. Well, it was nice.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Okay, well, thanks. It was great to meet you both, kind of face to face in this way. But I mean, this is as close as we get these days to anybody.
It certainly is. It certainly is. No, it made my night. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Everybody,
Okay.
stay well.